Hello and welcome to Homegrown Hangout. This is a extraordinarily special show. I am so glad to have with me the coolest person I've had on my show so far. Yes.
That's kind of depressing. I'm the coolest person. I'm very nerdy.
Well, cool in a political sense. Like you are.
Oh, okay. All right, fair enough.
The only comparison is I had the Star Trek communist on.
Oh,
So that was also cool. But yeah,
I have something to Google after the show.
so I am joined with Spike Cohen, the incredible libertarian who can now introduce himself.
Yeah. Hey, folks. Thanks for having. And Michael, thank you so much for having me on. My name is Spike Cohen. I was last year. I was the 2020 VP candidate for the Libertarian Party. My running mate was Joe Jorgensen. We were running for president and vice president. I am I guess, retired business owner and a political advocate and activist. And I also have some podcasts that I do and some shows that I do. And I that culminated in my becoming the VP candidate, and we went across the country and spread the message of liberty for the first time ever. We came in third in all 50 states, which sounds like a bigger deal than it really is because we were kind of still within the margin of error. But we certainly are proud of the accomplishment that we got, and now I'm going around the internet and the world, spreading the message of liberty both in person and online, like I'm doing here. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Awesome. So I would also consider myself to be a libertarian. More than that,
Mm-hmm.
I would also consider myself to be an anarchist. I've
Okay,
heard you call yourself an anarchist, but I
correct.
am more, you would call yourself an anarcho-capitalist, I would
So
assume,
somewhere
or
between
voluntarist.
yeah, so there's a few different terms: anarcho-capitalist, voluntarist, market anarchist. They're all kind of in the same realm. I am those things. I'm also a panarchist, which means that I
Mm.
don't have nearly the hubris required to think that if we were to snap our fingers and make government go away, that every single one of the 7.5 billion people on this planet are going to voluntarily organize their societies exactly the way that I think they should. So,
Sure.
for example, things like market socialism, things like anarcho-syndicalism, things like anarcho-communism, all of these things are things that can coexist in a society, in a basically a voluntary, coercionless society, and in a marketplace of ideas that is set free from coercion and threats of harm. We can see what works best, and we could probably end up with hybrid systems in between them. But yes, in my mind, the most efficient way, with all of the proof that I have, of course, the most efficient way that I believe that a society would work absent coercion is one that focuses primarily on private ownership of property.
All right, all right. Are you familiar with mutualism and market socialism and those sort of left market ideas?
I am. In fact, mutualism was the original libertarianism. If you look at Proudhon and the people that were the people to use the term libertarian, mutualism is probably, I don't know if they actually use the term mutualism, but that would best describe the type of system that they were using. So there was still capital. There was still using capital as a means of a store of wealth and a subjective gauge of value for things. But there wasn't. So, for example, in a more strict anarcho-capitalist society, property rights are very sticky, meaning that you can be an absentee owner of property. You can, when you die, you still own your property until you can bequeath it to someone else instead of it reverting to the commons and things like
Right.
that. Whereas in mutualism, that wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
So there, yeah, I mean, and this is why I try to look at these things like a
Well,
spectrum
I would
because
consider myself to be in the mutualist vein. I have
in the
called
mutualist.
myself a syndicalist in the past. I started out just calling. Well, initially I was called myself a libertarian, and I
Mhm,
like the Libertarian Party. I was going to vote for Gary Johnson, but I
mhm.
forgot to send in my request form because I was in college at the time. But I
Okay.
liked Gary Johnson, and I was pretty progressive. But well, that was before Gary. But then Bernie made I was always progressive, and then Bernie kind of brought me into more of the left analysis, of the more
Right.
class analysis of society. And that brought me to, that sort of brought me towards, alongside libertarian. I never stopped being a libertarian. I called myself a libertarian socialist in the past. And the whole point is, I see that workers should control the means of production instead of absentee. That I view absenteeism indefinitely as being a parasitic relationship, that you get out more than you put in. And if you're getting out more than you put in, it's someone else is putting in more than they're getting out.
Right, right. It's very interesting, the Bernie to Kropotkin pipeline. But you're not the only one. I mean, there are many people that
Absolutely.
their first exposure to the idea of as you would call it, class analysis and looking at critical theory of things starts with a more mainstream figure like a Bernie Sanders or an AOC or someone like that. Before you know it, you're reading the bread book and things like that, and then you're on. I just literally, after I said it, I saw mutual aid there. So yeah, it's a
well, this is also my work desk. So most people that I work with are not as savvy as you, so they don't catch the mutual aid. They don't know what it means. But I did have to hide that one, which is...
You don't have to hide that one. Listen, I read Marx. You have to go through the whole thing. Interestingly enough,
well,
after
it's not
reading
that
Marx,
I'm hiding it for myself. I'm hiding it from my work. I don't like...
Kropotkin, they don't know who that is. So
they don't know
okay.
who Kropotkin is.
Marx,
but
you
Marx
can see from the picture.
Marx.
That's funny. Who's Kropotkin?
Exactly.
Oh, the philosopher. Oh, cool. And then,
right.
But then they see, there's handshaking. That seems nice. Yeah. But then you go. So here's my take on, as you would call it, absentee ownership or private ownership of a business, as opposed to a mutual ownership, a worker ownership of a business. First of all, I don't have any problem with worker ownership of the means of production, and we can actually look at how the U.S. Code of Taxes and most developed nations' tax codes actually almost make it if not impossible, at least prohibitively expensive to do a worker-owned co-op. So if you want to have a true worker-owned co-op in the US, you either have to just be a bunch of workers paying the full tax rate, or you have to become a corporation. And if you become a corporation,
it has to be a group of workers that all of a sudden somehow have a large amount of capital that they have in order to invest in and create an enterprise.
More often than not, but even if they don't, let's say, for example, through a combination of sweat equity and and different factors, they are able to grow at least the beginnings of a business. That's just the beginning of their problems. If they do that, they now have to deal with the U.S. Code of Laws, a tax code that makes it nearly impossible to be able to do that. They're either having to pay 10 times as much as 10 times the tax rate of their corporate competitor, or they have to form a shell corporation for tax avoidance purposes, where they're having to do reporting of meetings, they're having to do share division. Depending on the size of the company, they may have to end up reporting to their state or federal regulators, because now it's a security that they're selling. It becomes a whole thing when it's just a group of people that wanted to own a restaurant together or build widgets together, and they are now in a distinct disadvantage. And many of that's what we often hear of, when a worker-owned co-op model will fail. More often than not, it's because it's not the business itself that failed. It was the fact that the hoops that they had to jump through,
Absolutely.
or if they weren't willing to go corporate, if they just said, no, we'll just pay the taxes like regular people.
Oh yeah, have you heard of the
you can't compete when someone's paying a tenth of the taxes.
Right. Have you heard of the Saratoga silverware company? Or I think it was, or Utica. There was a silverware company in Utica, New York, and it started out as a co-op. And after a generation, they incorporated and turned into a corporation because it was easier within the corporate structure.
Yeah. So with that said, here is why I don't see just the exit now you get into something like an Amazon or one of these major crony corporate companies that make $1 billion companies that also increasingly just become an extension of government, so that now the blur, and we're seeing that now talking about things like vaccine passports and stuff like that, the blur between public and private is almost non-existent at one point. You're basically looking at two faces of the same monster. I'm going to talk about my company, which was it was not a large business. I was able to retire off of it, and I have been told that I was a parasite because of that. But I want to talk about where I came from my business, so that you can tell me where, and tell me where you identify that I was being parasitic. Okay,
Sure, I would
so
love to.
so and I'm being serious.
Yeah.
Like I want, I always encourage people when I talk to that are left libertarians, I walk them through what I did. So when I started my company, I saved up money from working for someone else. I got my used laptop. I got the whatever software I could get legally or illegally, and I got the software. I learned how to use it, make a basic website, went around to businesses, offered my services for free. Now, here's where I may have been a parasite. I was still living with my parents because I was 16. So I wasn't having to worry about the cost of living. I was able to do stuff for free for a few months until I had a portfolio that I could show to people. Now, from there, I'm going around and I am I'm telling I'm offering people. At this point, this is the late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of people still didn't really believe their small business needed a website. So I'd give it to them for free or very low charge, just as a proof of concept. And if they wanted to keep it, then they're paying, an ongoing fee or whatever. And I was able to build a fairly successful, for a few years, build a very successful, basically self-employment model. Now, I reached a point where I was much better at selling website products than I was at actually making them. I could go to a conference and sell 50 or 60 packages, and now I'd hate my life for 4 or 5 months because I'm having to actually make all these websites. And I'm like, this is time I could be spending going and selling more packages. So
Sure.
I started outsourcing to people. I
Yeah.
started finding people where I would say, hey, I can pay you this much to make this website. You're not having to work for someone else, and you're not having to work for a set company. You can set your own hours, set your own time, and everything else. You're not having to spend money on marketing to procure your client. You're not having to do a lot of people that are in the website design space. They don't want to talk to clients. They don't really want to talk to me if they don't have to. And so they're not having to worry about that. I'm getting them the clients. I'm giving them the package to do, and then I'm keeping some of the money because of my role in the sales and procurement of that client. Now, some people have told me that that was the moment that I became a parasite. I would argue I was still working in that moment because I still had a role there. I was procuring the client, bringing it to the person, and it was still more of almost like a partnership model. Even though I was at the top of it, there was still a partnership involved. Everyone was doing a role. Now, right before I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I was working my way into the model to where I was bringing people in to do the sales part as well, and where I would now be managing the actual legal and tax and management structure of the company itself, right? So now I have something where I'm dealing with the taxes, I'm dealing with the the legality of it, I'm dealing with the bigger clients and projects that I don't want to pass along to someone that I've just brought in on sales, but they're doing the day-to-day stuff. I'm still managing if there's any kind of issues. If the salesperson is dealing with an issue or needs mentorship or guidance on what they're doing right or wrong, if there's some kind of I guess interpersonal communications problem between the salesperson and the design people, or if there's a problem between the salesperson and a client or anything like that, I can step in and do that. That was where I was getting when the point where I was diagnosed with MS. Had it been a few more years going on, I would have eventually reached a point where I would have brought people in to do even those things as well, to do the work of the the tax work and the HR work if the company was big enough to even need such a thing, or just someone to just do general fire putting out roles. And eventually I would literally just own a thing that I built from the ground up that I could then sell to someone else and say, here you go, here's my thing that I made. Now, somewhere in between, right around the time I was diagnosed with MS, or the time that never came because I wasn't able to become the billionaire business owner. That is when most people on the left, including left authoritarians, but also left libertarians as well, would say that that's when I was transitioning from being an actual active role in that company to being in the, I guess, parasite class, or the capitalist or owner class. But I'm interested in your thoughts on it.
So, all right. First thing, the idea that it's a dichotomy between contributing and parasitism is, I feel, a little bit of a misnomer. That you can very much still be an active contributor and very much actively contribute, but if you are taking in value greater than the value generated by your labor, that's because you're taking that value that was generated by the workers. Let me put
someone else, right?
Yeah, let me put it in a better. Another question I had was in terms of time scale. How long was it a sole proprietorship, and then it was a sole proprietor? There was multiple phases, and each phase takes a certain amount of time. The amount of time very much takes into account. So,
okay. I would argue it didn't, but that's where the difference between
sure,
the subjective labor value, subjective theory of value, and the labor theory
yeah,
of value are. But with that said, so I would say I'm asking people, driving around in my 86 LeBaron, asking people if they want a free website, to the point where I'm retiring because of MS, but was at the point where I was about to scale up into just being a strict owner, was about, let's say, about 20 years, or 19 years. The
okay,
time that I went from,
all right,
the time I went from not making a single penny driving around in the LeBaron to having other people on, where I would, as you would call it, extracting the value of their labor, would be about maybe 5 or 6 years. Yeah, I guess 6 years, something like that.
So,
are you doing a calculation?
Not a calculation. I'm just like to have the numbers out. I don't have the math equations. Hopefully, I would love to develop math equations, but I'm still trying to. So the way that I view it is that you have your initial investment, and that initial investment is a certain amount of value, and that is at the beginning, and alongside the amount of labor, or the value of the labor that you were contributing as a sole proprietorship. And you contributed all the labor, and everything you received was yours. You were the sole worker who was in control of the means of production. That's awesome.
It was just me. Yeah.
Exactly. And then it changed when you started hiring people. When you started hiring people to contract out and to do some of the work. The thing that happened is that you set the terms. They could only agree to them. So because
well, actually, so there, I have to correct you slightly there.
Okay.
There was negotiation on it. So there were times people would just say that's fine, but I had other people would say, no, I won't do it for that much. I'll do it for that much. And I'd say, well, how about this much? And they go, oh, how about that much? And we'd say, okay. So there was some negotiation, but I understand what you're saying.
Well,
there was a set term that I was willing to do.
Implicit in the arrangement, it is understood that you are in charge and you have an amount of power over them because you were the one setting the terms. And then as long as they are associated with you, you can set the terms. You could fire them at will for any major infractions. Say, I don't want to work with you. You were, I would say, the fact that you were contracting out instead of having set employment is better, but not perfect. I would prefer that you were to form a cooperative where, say, you had maybe 5 votes or 20 votes or however many votes you were in the enterprise, and then as soon as they join, they get 1 vote, and then the next year they get 2 votes. So as long as they continue working there, their amount of say accumulates, because that is my big issue. It's less about the financial aspect. It's about who has the say, who has the control, who makes the decisions, where does the power come from. I prefer non-hierarchical decision-making, or arrangements that if there is hierarchy, it's not permanent, that it's change is built into it, that you definitely put in a lot of work at the beginning of starting the enterprise, but as you take on workers, you are continuing to contribute labor, so you're continuing to contribute value.
Right.
You have a certain amount of value. While they work at the enterprise as well, they do also contribute value. Their labor is contributing value, and you would say that, oh, you're compensating them for all of the value, but I would argue that the surplus value, the amount that they're creating that they're not being compensated, is the equivalent of them buying into the system.
Okay. So then my question to you would be, and this is where the breakdown, because I, for a very long time, when I was getting into libertarian schools of thought, there were times where the labor theory of value made sense to me, but then there was an issue that I could never get around, and it's what's colloquially known as the calculation problem. But I'm honestly, the calculation problem is more of a macroeconomics issue. I'm going to apply it just to this.
Sure.
If value is not subjective, so if it is not what I would call it, which is that the person that in this scenario is saying, I believe that my work is worth around this much, and that's why I'm willing to do it. And I'm factoring in the fact that I'm not having to deal with marketing. I'm not having to deal with the client. I'm really just being given a project. I get to focus on what I like to do. And then I hand it off to you. You clearly are the one that like to go and, be a social butterfly and talk to people and sales and schmooze and all of that stuff. I'm willing to do it for this. So that's my equation of that it's more of a subjective thing. If it's not a subjective thing, and if there is an objective labor-based value of what someone's labor is, how is that calculated? Because it can't be just calculated on the number of hours spent, because if that were taking it to its most logical extreme, that could mean that I could go into a field, jump up and down, and create value as a result of it, right? So obviously there has to be some kind of calculation there.
Sure. That you went into sort of the argument against the labor theory of value, that worthless labor exists, therefore labor theory of value disproved. I don't see it that way, and I don't see it as subjective theory of value as being in conflict with the labor theory of value. And the reason I think that is that you're leaving out a third view of value, and that is the utilitarian theory of value. That I view the subjective theory of value as the synthesis between the utilitarian theory of value and the labor theory of value. That the labor theory of value, a lot of people think that it just means, labor is valuable, and it is valuable because it is laborious, and the labor that went into it is the value. That is not what the labor theory of value actually argues. The labor theory of value argues, simply put, that the value of a commodity comes from the labor that went into creating it or acquiring it. Well, the creating it is the traditional Marxian. I add acquiring it in order to facilitate like raw materials like bottled water and such. So the synthesis is that value is based on both utility and labor, in that value is measured by utility, but created by labor. So let's say you have a given... let's use your company, for example. I usually like to do it in abstract of raw materials and commodities. But let me try to apply it to you. That your arrangement, that the commodity that is being sold is the program, and a lot of things go into the creation of that commodity, and it is the labor of you selling it, and it is the labor of your employees that are creating that program or that product that you then sell. And that the utility is how that value is measured, that ultimately someone decides to buy it for a set amount of price. And that determines the collective value of the labor that went into it. That it's less that labor measures value, it's more that labor creates it, and that it's utility that measures what labor created. That if you spend 20 hours pounding mud, and then there is no utility value,
Right,
then because
right.
there's no utility value, then that labor
There's no
created
value to that
zero
labor.
value.
Right, right, right. So then I guess my question then is, how are we, because and this is where I always brought me back to believing in the subjective value theory, because if it's not being if it is not the consumer of the whatever the good, service, commodity, whatever it is we're talking about, if it isn't the consumer that ultimately decides the value, and this is true, I believe, even in a case where there's a set price for something. So for example, at a store that sells chicken sandwiches for $2, if their chicken sandwich is terrible and no one wants to spend $2 for it, eventually they either go out of business or the price has to go down to match the equilibrium of what people are willing to pay, or they have to make their sandwich better to make it worth $2. Either way, it's ultimately the consumer that, in that case, and again, this is a
Well,
a
I
very
consider
simple model, but
I would also say that subjective theory of value is a bit of a misnomer, because I view the subjectivity to be less about value itself and more about price. And that price is subjective, but value is either labor or utility. But then price and value being separate. I view price as being a separate entity than value. That something has value, but that is not just its price. A sunset has value, but you don't put a price tag on it.
Right. But so then I guess my question is, just to make sure we're not arguing about this two definitions for the same thing.
Sure.
Are you ultimately saying you believe that the consumer or consumers of a good or service are the ones that are determining what it costs, what its value is to them?
Well, not quite determining, more measuring. And that it's...
So that's pretty close to what I think. So this is where, yeah, okay. So that's, okay, fair enough. So then in that calculation...
that the act of buying it, or the consumer, sort of acts as a scale, and that they are the scale to which we measure the value of a product. In that scale, when you step on a scale, the scale is not creating your weight, it's just measuring your weight.
It's measuring it.
I would argue that that value, that weight, was created by the labor that went into it.
That's fair enough. I'm thinking about how I need to eat less. But you're right. So I will agree with that part of it. Now, I would still say there's a subjectivity, and it's possible that we're both saying the same thing here.
Because, I think we might be.
If I've just eaten very well and I'm so stuffed I can't imagine eating again, and you haven't eaten all day long because you've been so busy, and we look at the sandwich and you go, man, I don't care what that tastes like, I'm going to eat it. And I go, no, I don't. In that moment, even though that thing may have whatever utility value it has to it, it means more to you in that moment.
I love that analogy. Actually want, if you don't mind, I want to apply it to jobs and employment.
Yes. Please go down that rabbit hole.
That right now we have sort of an economic underclass, and this is a class of people who are in poverty, and they have much less. They have less than they would like. They are at a constant need, and therefore any amount of compensation for a job they'll agree to, no matter what they're doing. That it doesn't matter how much value they're creating, they're willing to get paid anything, because anything is better than what they have. And class of people with that sort of relationship to employment necessarily brings down the price of labor and makes the average worker incredibly expendable. That you're at constant fear of being replaced, because there's always going to be someone who's willing to accept less for what you're doing, for harder work than what you're doing.
It's an economic race to the bottom, because there is a labor glut in this country where you have a ton of people. If you're applying basic supply and demand, government has created a situation whereby the number of people looking for good jobs vastly outstrips the availability of good job, whatever good means, right? Subjective,
Right.
utilitarian, whatever. A job that can pay a living wage, there is far less of that than the supply of people who are looking for it, which drives down the cost of or value of that labor, and as a result, they're willing to be able to take much less of it. And this is where we probably would agree quite a bit. If you look at things like redlining, if you look at things like harmful zoning laws, NIMBY laws, if you look at things like occupational licensing, if you look at things like the school to prison pipeline that makes people not puts people in a situation where they're being used as slave labor instead of being able to develop a marketable skill and be able to contribute to society. If you look at disproportionate use of police force against disadvantaged communities and individuals so that they're less able to be able to thrive. If you look at all of the things that contribute to specific individuals and groups of individuals that are doing considerably and disproportionately worse, whether we're talking about Appalachia or the inner city or anything else, this lends itself to our situation, which is why I don't like when people on the right, including some libertarians, they'll go, well, yeah, I mean, that's what their value, that's what their labor's worth. And if they don't like it, they should get another job. And it's like, well, that's not actually really possible. What we need to look at is the conditions that led to that happening. You and I, and this is why I believe in libertarian unity, because we can sit here and get into a debate about whether
The
value
morality
is
of
being
absentee ownership of private property is
right. Yeah, exactly. The absentee. We can get into something like that, or even get into where we're sitting here figuring out we agree about value because we're arguing over whether it's being subjectively valued or measured. Well, meanwhile, we have overlords that are imposing a system on us that makes
absolutely.
us increasingly impoverished and dependent on them in all aspects of our lives,
Well,
and
here's
treats us
sort of
increasingly like
my
cattle.
issue with your analysis in that you view the government as being the big bad, the end all. We get rid of the government and that solves the problem. I don't see it that way because I view the government as being puppets, and they are puppets of their controllers, the people that donate to their political campaigns, the wealthy elites, the capitalist ruling class. That we have an economic ruling class of individuals who have so much wealth and power that they use that wealth and power in order to influence the system to make them more wealthy and more powerful. And that power consolidates, and they use the state in order to facilitate that. And I don't think they have any interest in ever getting rid of the state, and the state will remain because it will continue to benefit them unless a revolution of ANCAPs decide we're just getting rid of the state, but I will still submit to the whim of the dictator of my workplace.
Yeah, and see that's a misnomer among actual ANCAPs, and I will say that there are at least some edgy libertarians who help push that misconception. The reality is, and you said it, they use the state government, whatever you want to call it, is the vehicle or the tool that they use to preserve their wealth and power and ownership of capital and their market share, for lack of a better word. They are preserving their share, which is I say their share, their massive disproportionate share of the ownership of everything, not just the means of production, but property, capital, and people at some point, where they're really essentially owning people in everything but actual deed and title. This is because of the coercion that they were able to exert, in this case through the state. And they make it easier exerting it this way because instead of it looking like them hiring a bunch of mercenaries and looking like the bad guys that are hiring bad guys to hurt you, instead they're using government. Government is something we need to keep a civil society. And there may be some things that are wrong with it that we can fix on the edges, but really government's necessary. How else would we have roads without government? And so they use this government, which is essentially a protection racket that exists to extract from us, to rob from us, with regressive tax models, which frankly, every tax model is ultimately regressive because the consumer pays the tax. But that's a whole other value. That's a whole other subject. when they extract from us, they're giving to them. And sometimes they do it in the form of giving them massive bailouts, like we saw with these so-called stimulus bills. They just hand them trillions of dollars. The Federal Reserve prints out the money, gives it to government, not just our Federal Reserve, central banks around the world print out money, give to their governments. The government gives the monopoly money away to the cronies that put them in office. And then we get stuck with the bill because those all had to be bonded out or billed out. So now we're paying interest, 20, 30, 40 years of interest on it. So we're being robbed to pay for our overlords to continue to be richer and richer and richer and more powerful. And because technology makes our lives increasingly convenient, we're told, yeah, your life's getting better. Yeah, but proportionate to how this guy's living, we're continuing to do worse and worse and worse. And we have the data to show it. So what I say is this: when you remove the coercion, these people are no longer overlords. They're soft bodies with a lot of stuff that they can't possibly keep a hold of. Now, I'm not proposing that we go around and just start robbing everyone, but I am saying that a company like an Amazon or a Walmart or an Apple, absent the protections and enforcement mechanisms that are afforded to them by the state that they control, they're now a big, lumbering, unresponsive company that will be eaten alive by their competition 7 ways to Sunday. Absent those coercions, if they don't have the state protecting their bogus IP claims on all the patent squatting that they do, if they don't have a business model that gives them more money than they pay in taxes, if they don't have a government model that's enforcing all of their claims over others, if they're not getting massive bailouts, if they're not getting these ridiculous no-bid multi-billion-dollar contracts, they can't hope to survive, much less thrive, in an actual market set free. And that market set free includes worker-owned co-ops. It includes people saying, you know what, I don't want to work for someone. I want to create a democratic model of business where we all have a predetermined and agreed to, for lack of a better word, hierarchy within the company that, like you said, can change based on the value that they're adding to it as decided by the people within that democratic model. All of that exists in a world set free. I'm more focused. I'm fine with having conversations and debates and discussions about, absentee ownership, stickiness of property ownership, whether this is personal property or capital, all of these things. I am.
Well, it depends how you
fine.
use it.
Well, but that's the thing. I use it for all sorts of things. So what percentage means of production but I'm cool with having all of these discussions even now. I think that I'm not going to allow whatever disagreements we walk away from this in still having after this is over, to not have us be allies in who is actually keeping us in a position of being beholden to them. And I think that if we in our debates and in our discussions and disagreements and everything else, if we remember that my enemy, by the way, I wore a red shirt because I just wore a red shirt. I didn't even, as I'm doing this, I'm like, oh wow, how
poetic,
serendipitous. But no, I put on a red shirt. I was actually wearing an orange shirt, but I got something on it, so now I'm wearing a red shirt. But
hey, orange for mutualism.
Hey, oh wow. See, I need to check my calendar. You know what? If I had checked my calendar, I might have second guessed myself about wearing red. Huh. Anyway, so so all that to say that I'm not going to allow, and I hope you don't, our differences of opinion, which the more you talk about it, it turns out it's definitional stuff 9 times out of 10. But even our serious disagreements on things like absentee ownership of property and things like that, or whether or not you should be able to bequeath everything you've accumulated after you die, or whether it should revert to the commons. These are legitimate concerns and serious things that we should be discussing. And we should be discussing them in very, we should not, just say, oh, well, we're friends, so we'll work that out later. No, we should have those disagreements and work them out. But I'm not going to allow that difference in opinion to keep me and you from working together to let people know the story of how we got here and what the problem is. Now, in the same way that I work with people like constitutionalists, I work with minarchists, I work with people across the libertarian spectrum, both up and down, left and right, because we all recognize that we are on a boat that is careening towards a waterfall, and we need to turn the boat around and work it back this way. And on this way here, we can figure out which stream we want to go down. We may break off into different parties that are going down different streams, and we can figure out what exits, or not exits on a river, but what stops we want to get off at. That's all perfectly fine. But let's turn the boat around in the meantime. Let's agree that we need to turn the boat around and kick the current captains off.
Well, I love this. I think that this is a fantastic place for us to be. I think we definitely understand each other's positions. I'm happy you know a lot about mutualism. I'm gonna be honest. I debate with ANCAPs on Facebook all the time, and you are so refreshing because I gotta say, they have no fucking clue what they're talking about.
So I will encourage everyone really debating in general. You shouldn't debate crockpot recipes on Facebook. Just in general, that's like a terrible way to learn things. There
Yeah.
are a lot of people, and I don't think this is specific to anarcho-capitalism, but it certainly exists with anarcho-capitalism. There are a lot of people that consider themselves ANCAPs, that if you press them on the things that Mises or Rothbard or even Locke said about, and Locke wasn't an ANCAP, but certainly property, he was one of the early definers of things about property. If you really start to, break them down into, what Hazlitt said and what Knox said and what these folks said about things, they get a little shaky because when they're thinking ANCAP, and I will admit, I was someone that when I first started hearing ANCAP and thought I was it, I realized later that at that point I wasn't an ANCAP or a market anarchist. A lot of them are associating being an ANCAP with, we just make government go away, but everything else pretty much stays the same. And that isn't even close to being true. It couldn't be true. Even if that is what we believe, that would be a total pipe dream, because there's no way that the current structure can exist without a massive super state, a massive and growing super state imposing itself on all of us. The reason you're being spied on in every aspect of your life, all these cameras staring at us, the reason we're being spied on, the reason that the police presume the authority to be able to use whatever force they want and be protected by qualified immunity, the reason that the state exerts the authority to be able to use you as slave labor if you own a plant that they don't like, even if it's a plant that other people can use, but you can't because you can't afford the license to sell it. The reason it does all of this, if you break down every single aspect of how the state imposes itself on you, it is a greater story of how it is extracting from you to give to someone else. Harry Brown, who was Joe Jorgensen, my running mate, when she ran it for vice president in 96, her presidential running mate was a man named Harry Brown. And he was honestly, the fact that he isn't talked about as much as Ron Paul is a travesty.
Is he your grand president?
He's my grandpa president. Yeah. No, he is my grand president. Yeah. Harry Brown was in 96 and 2000. And Harry Brown used to say, government or the state comes over, breaks your legs, takes your wallet, buys a little bit, uses some of the money to buy you crutches, and then says, hey, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have those crutches. Every single thing that government is giving to you, it first took from you. And I can't, I mentioned briefly about the tax model. You may not be one of them, but I met many left libertarians who say, well, I'm okay with taxes as long as they're progressive. Well, I'm going to challenge that.
So
Go ahead.
I've been doing a lot of research into modern monetary theory in terms of
MMT,
taxes. Yep. And I find it entertaining. But I would say that hopefully if we could have another discussion, that I would love for if we could talk about the differences between private property and use-based property. Because honestly, I think that is the real baseline axiomatic disagreement between right libertarians and left libertarians. Is right libertarians are like, well, private property is my God-given right, and I'm like, well,
I own this thing.
Maybe it should be based more on use, in that if you do not use something, you do not contribute to it, your claim of ownership over it over time will gradually no longer come into consideration.
I would love to have those discussions with you, and you know how to reach out to Brian. I'd love to come back on soon to talk about that. The one thing I want to leave with is saying this. I believe, and I hope you agree with me on this, absent the coercion, and when I say coercion, you'll notice I say coercion, not just government, absent coercion.
I appreciate that.
Absent coercion, absent force, especially mass force, but really force in general, absent any kind of real centralized coercion, I believe that our arguments that we're having right now, or our debates, will largely over time work themselves out in the wash. Because in a market set free, in a people set free, the models that work the best, not just for the consumer, but for the actual people working in those models, now that they're empowered as well in this situation, will work itself out. And I personally believe that more than likely, it's not going to be a strict ANCAP or strict ANCOM or strict anarcho-syndicalist or strict mutualist thing that's going to happen. I think what you're going to find is a series of hybrid models that have far more to do with the reality on the ground in that area and works best for those people in that area, which is why I'm also a strong believer in localization. I think that community-based solutions are the way forward, and eventually community-based markets. And I think that, again, I love to have these discussions, and I go into these discussions not wanting to be right or proven right, because the best way to become right is to find out what's true. Then I'm really right. Now I'm not just arguing, I'm actually finding out what's right.
I like to talk with people I disagree with because I learn. I like to learn, and exactly. I like to have as much information as possible. The more data I've got in the brain, the more accurate, hopefully, my model can become. I have a background in physics, so I'm a science STEM guy. I didn't really get into
very data
that.
driven.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so I would love to come back on in the future. And in the meantime, like I said, I think that as long as we recognize that we have a common foe, and it ain't us, okay? We have a common foe, and that our goal needs to be to end the systems of coercion that we have now and decentralize power as much as possible.
Well, I think we do have a common foe. I just think that we have slightly shifted foes. Your foe is the state specifically. My foe is the capital that controls it. And that it's that capital that will, absent the state, whoever has the most capital afterwards will be able to establish whatever fiefdom or whatever enterprise they're in control of now. They're able to maintain control of it, and those enterprises become the new states absent a state above them.
And see, that's where our disagreements are, because what I would say is that, for example, if I'm a guy with a giant tank with, turret-mounted machine gun, and someone takes that away from me, I'm just a guy now. And whatever I had behind me that I stole from everyone that I'm protecting, I'm just a guy going, hey, don't take my stuff. Now, what you would say is, yeah, but they could take all of that and create new states. Exactly. I would still call that the enemy. So I'm not saying it's just the state. I'm saying that the state is the enforcement mechanism of the people in positions of power. I don't see a distinction between those who are in the elites. I don't use the term capitalist, although the original definition of capitalism was defined by Engels and Marx. So using their definition, fine. The capitalists are the problem. I'm now using a repurposed. I've homesteaded and repurposed the term capitalism and into being a model of free market economics that uses capital as a medium for exchange and allows for the private voluntary ownership of property. All of that aside, again, where it's a definitional thing, we recognize the same enemy. We may use different terms to describe, and we may do a chicken and egg approach to which part is worse or better. But ultimately, I don't really see a big distinction. People in power are imposing themselves on us and trying to condition and convince us that this is a good thing that we have.
Well, I see it less as state specifically and as hierarchy. That hierarchy is the problem, that when people put themselves in position of authority over others, including in the workplace, that those positions of power allow them to be assholes and be assholes with authority. And
that's fair. I would add coerced authority or a coerced hierarchy, but hierarchy in a coerced system, a hierarchy, at least to that level, is certainly a problem. I would argue that my hiring someone to do web design, that's still technically a hierarchy, but that's not a harmful thing. But the harmful thing is when there's force and when they're actually cornering entire markets and putting people in a situation of desperation. If I controlled all the property in my area and I'm telling everyone, okay, you get to continue living on your property that you used to own that I bought, if you do this website, and if you don't, I kick you out and you starve to death, then yes, we have a problem. And you and I would certainly agree on that.
No, all right. I think that this is a good place to keep it now. I actually have stuff afterwards that I have to go take care of. So
No, this was a great conversation. I look forward to it. Look
all
forward
right.
to future ones.
Thank you so much. I would love to see you again. All right, let me.
I would love that, man.
How do I? God damn it! All right, could you hit? Could you leave the meeting first so that way I can do things easier?
Sure, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Talk
Have
to
a
you
good
soon.
one. All right. Perfect. So, I'm so happy that I was able to have him on. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I would have liked to have spoken up a little bit more, but whatever. I'm just happy to have someone like him on. And yeah, please subscribe, like, do all the doobly things that make it so YouTube shows me to people. Peace.